In the first video of this series, we looked at the anatomy of the respiratory system. We considered the lungs and their position in the body above the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles between the ribs and the trachea and the bronchi. I'd like to represent that one more time here, but in a very simplified form. So if we consider the trachea, the bronchi, I'm not going to draw bronchioles, I'll just represent the lungs, simply like that. We have the pleural membranes around the lungs and also on the inside of the body cavity. So I'll just represent that this way, across the diaphragm there, like that. So on the surface of the lung there's the other pleural membrane, and of course the heart is inside here, in this space there. This is the diaphragm under here. And we've got the rib muscles between the ribs, and the ribs are out here like that. And then the body itself. If we recognize the structures of the respiratory system, what we're not looking at yet is how it works. That's the topic of this video. How does this system work in order to get oxygen from the air into our blood? Now, if you just stop breathing for a quick second, because as you're not taking in oxygen and you're not exhaling carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide level in your blood will continue to increase. So will the hydrogen level. So we have a buildup of hydrogen ions and carbon dioxide. Change pens. Hydrogen ions and carbon dioxide. This will cause a lowering of the pH of blood. pH of blood is supposed to be somewhere around 7.38 in lung tissue, and it travels around the body. In muscle tissue, it might be as low as 7.35. But if the hydrogen ion concentration of blood starts to increase, then that's going to denature proteins and things like that. So hydrogen ion concentration increase would mean a lowering of the pH, remember. And if carbon dioxide level increases, then that's another toxic impact. We have a part of our body, the medulla oblongata, and inside the medulla oblongata there's a thing called the respiratory center. The respiratory center of the medulla oblongata is sensitive to the concentrations of hydrogen and carbon dioxide. So if this hydrogen ion concentration starts to increase above a threshold level, and the carbon dioxide concentration starts to increase above a threshold level, the respiratory center, being sensitive to that, initiates nerve impulses. Now these nerve impulses, there's two of them actually. One nerve called the phrenic nerve goes to the diaphragm. The other nerve in this part of the topic anyways is the intercostal nerve. And the intercostal nerve conducts impulses to the intercostal muscles. So now let's take that topic back to here. We have in our brain a region called the medulla oblongata, and it detects concentrations of those two gases, or these of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions, and when they become critical, it sends impulses down to the muscles in between the ribs, both sides. It also sends nerve impulses down to the diaphragm on that side as well, the rib muscles on that side as well. These nerves are not cranial nerves. It's not like the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve number 10. These nerves are actually nerves that come out of the neck region. This one comes out of the neck region, the cervical region. This one actually leaves the central nervous system in the thoracic region, so you're actually in the upper chest region. Regardless, when they get to these muscles, they cause these muscles to contract. And when these muscles contract, obviously they shorten, and the shortest distance between 2 points is always a straight line. So if you look at the shape of the diaphragm is arched up like this when it's relaxed. When it's contracted between here and here, it actually flattens out. So it moves down like that. So when it's relaxed, it has that bowed up shape like that. When it's contracted, the muscle is shorter when it's a straight line. So the diaphragm contracts, moves down like that. The rib muscles are actually, the rib cage is this shape represented this way, and when these muscles contract, it moves the ribs this way. Both of these things, the lowering of the diaphragm, the moving of the ribs this way, increase the thoracic cavity. They increase the volume of this space inside here. Increasing the volume of this space means that the air pressure inside the lung tissue, inside the alveoli, decreases. When you have a decreased pressure like this, air is drawn in naturally through the nose and through down the trachea. So this negative pressure effect here causes air to come in. As the air comes in, it causes the expansion of these alveoli, and as they expand, as the lungs expand, they actually move a little bit because you're filling this space up. As this space fills up, it actually changes shape a little bit. It has a pleural membrane on the outside of it. The pleural membrane, the outer pleural membrane on the inside of the rib cage is adjacent to it. They're both moist, and these two pleural membranes actually move differently. They actually, this one on the outside will allow the one on the inside to slide against it. So as the lung expands, you get this frictionless surface, so the lungs can actually expand and change shape against the body wall, which is not expanding. It's getting larger, but it's not expanding in the same way as the lung tissue is expanding. There's another feature to these pleural membranes. They're both wet membranes. They're adjacent to each other. We say there's an intrapleural space between them, but like I said before, there's no appreciable volume to that space. What it does as these muscles are contracting, it's pulling the rib cage out, and the inner pleural membrane tends to stick to that outer pleural membrane. So as it pulls it, it's actually pulling the inner pleural membrane, and it's helping the lungs expand. So the lungs expand like that. So you take a deep breath in, sooner or later you breathe out. So how does the body know when to breathe out? The breathing in was caused by this contraction, the combined contraction of those two sets of muscles. When you exhale, the thing that triggers exhalation is the alveoli themselves. They have nerve endings called stretch receptors. Now the alveoli, if you remember, are delicate, little, single, little spherical shapes like this. They're one cell thick. The walls of these things are one cell thick. And they're not very strong, but as they expand, it puts stretch or tension on the outside of these things. And there's stretch receptors on the outside surface of these things. They say, when they get stretched, stretch receptor, that's a nerve ending. They send a nerve impulse back to the MO, to the medulla oblongata, and that cancels these contractions. So the alveoli have stretch receptors that signal the end of the contractions. when you no longer have these muscles contracting, the diaphragm relaxes. It goes from this position to this position. It puts pressure upwards on the bottom of the thoracic cavity. The rib cage is no longer held open like that, and just gravity alone brings it back down. There's two things to note in this story. One of them is that inhaling is an active process. It requires muscle contraction. It requires that the body spend ATP energy. Exhaling, on the other hand, exhaling is a passive process. It's muscle relaxation. So there's a big difference in terms of the amount of energy required to breathe in versus breathe out. If you blow out, then what you're doing is forcing contraction of these muscles or forcing relaxation of these muscles, but other muscles in addition to these, and that causes blowing out forcibly, and that's an active process. That's a different thing. So there's there's two other things we should mention before we leave this topic. This system is the normal triggering system for inhalation. There is another system. There's another way that the body responds to it. So I'll just remove this bit here. This is the primary trigger. There's a secondary trigger, and that's the sensitivity to oxygen concentration in blood. There are oxygen-sensitive chemoreceptors. Again, chemical receptor endings. These are in the aortic arch and the carotid arteries. And their location is pretty significant if you think about it for a second, because the aortic arch is the part of the major blood vessel that's leaving the heart. It's delivering oxygenated blood to the body. So if the oxygen level in that blood isn't high enough, these chemoreceptors are going to recognize it. The ones that are in the carotid or carotid arteries are the ones going up to your brain, going up to your head, which feeds your brain. Again, if the oxygen concentration isn't high enough in that, these chemoreceptors will initiate contraction as well. So this is the primary system, the one that's normally functioning, but in odd circumstances it may be that you need to have a secondary system. You can't afford to be delivering blood that isn't oxygenated enough. One other thing. These pleural membranes provide a seal to the thoracic cavity. If you consider it, the only way in is down the trachea. That seal goes all the way around. So if you're taking that thoracic cavity, you're enlarging it, given that air has to come in that way and air goes out that way, it works very well. But what happens if? What happens if, for example, there's an injury to the chest wall and there's another opening? Suppose someone pierces their chest wall and there's another opening and allows air in from the side, like a knife stab perhaps, or something like that. What would happen then is that as these muscles contract, the same effect, the thoracic cavity is going to enlarge, air is going to come in here, but air is also going to come in here. When air comes in here, that prevents the lung from expanding. So this lung will collapse. That's called a pneumothorax. Pneumothorax, a collapsed lung, and it's caused by perhaps a gaping chest wound. And one of the things they say is if there's a situation like that, you seal that wound, you prevent the air from getting in there, and medically they actually have to vacuum out the air from this space around the lung, and once it's evacuated and the hole is sealed up or the wound is sealed, then the system can return to normal. That's the end of this topic on the mechanics of breathing. I've already alluded to the next topic, and that's the one that I just erased from here, the fact that alveoli have stretch receptors. The alveoli are very specialized structures in our circulatory system, in our respiratory system, and that's the topic of our next video. Thank you very much.